Hey, everybody. I'm here with Julie Nelson. Julie is a future. One of my favorite lines. I'm a big Muppets fanatic. And
I love the two old guys in this, up in the
Statler and
balcony.
Waldorf. Yeah. So there's a line from one of the original Muppet movies that Gonzo sings. He says, "There's not a word yet for old friends who've just met." And I have a feeling that you and I are going to hit it off and be fast friends who just met. So, uh, Julie is a certified family life educator. She's a certified clinical trauma specialist. She's got her master's degree from Utah State University, the family and human development in family and human development, and she's been involved in tons of professional endeavors, all revolving around strengthening families and strengthening marriages. She's currently working at UVU, Utah Valley University, in the family science department, right?
Yeah.
And you're the faculty supervisor for the Stronger Families Project. You've written multiple books. You've spent over 10 years with DWS and DHS developing and overseeing community parenting classes and enrichment programs for parents and their children. You've spoken at national conferences and state conferences. You're a very highly regarded and highly respected person in your profession. And I love that I get to talk to you today. There's not a lot of people who have the experience that you have on this topic, and I think that that our listeners are going to get a lot of value out of this conversation, because I think it's something that I think it's talked about in passing a lot, but it's not something that people really understand. And I think that anyway. So the topic we're talking about is what happens when your expectations go unmet, or managing your expectations in marriage.
Mm-hmm.
So you actually proposed this topic, which I loved. I kind of hit you up and said, "Hey, what would you want to talk about? What would get you excited?" And you proposed this topic. Why were you excited to talk about this?
I teach marriage and relationship skills, marriage and dating, basically, at UVU, and have for, 8 years or something like that. And we teach out of two books. And the second book I'm going to reference in our discussion today, because I really like it. It's called Fighting for Your Marriage. And encourage viewers to get that book if they're in a relationship, and it really has some great stuff in there. And it's the second book that we cover, and the last chapters are about managing expectations, because it's kind of like saving the best for last, where this is where it all comes together, because expectations is the root. In fact, William Shakespeare said expectation is the root of all heartache.
Interesting.
If Shakespeare says it, I guess it's true, right?
Yeah.
And even though it's through marriage, I think that anyone can relate to this topic, because even though, you could be cohabiting, you could be married, it could be a work relationship, it could be a family. And especially I teach parenting at UVU as well. And parents have a lot of expectations for their kids. And anything like that, you're going to set yourself up for someone's going to, disappoint you.
Oh, for sure.
So all the time, every day. So how do you manage those? We come to, especially marriage, with a list, invisible list. Even if you took a pre-marriage course, you're not going to hit the millions of different things that come up every day. That, like you said, the micro we talked about before this taping, micro and macro. There's a lot of micro. Those are minutia of every day of how do you load the dishwasher,
Yeah.
I was kind of surprised and a little bit, I don't know, disappointed that my husband didn't approve of the way that I loaded, with all the little forks sticking up like this. And I just had to turn them all over up, I hide them this way.
Yep.
Little things like that. It just really, it just is part of the invisible contract in marriage of everyday living. And no matter what we talk about ahead of time, living together is a whole other matter. And so you bring these expectations, whether you voice them or even cognizant of them or not, to a marriage. And it is the foundation for everyday living, that you have to share space and share ideas. And the marriage experience, or any relationship, involves expectations that are not being met.
Yes. I think
that's the whole thing. It's of expectations not being met, and how we manage our disappointment determines our happiness or our unhappiness. That's
man, I want you to say that again.
So our marriage or any relationship involves expectations not being met. So just plan for it. And
Yeah.
how you manage your disappointment with that determines our happiness or our unhappiness.
Oh, that's
Because if
so
you if
huge.
you if you sit there in your disappointment, you're going to be unhappy.
Right. And I think it's really easy to enjoy or find some sort of sick satisfaction in wallowing in that disappointment.
Yeah.
Wallowing in the unmet expectation of
Yeah,
it
it
all.
makes me feel superior because I'm right, you didn't do what I thought, and therefore you're wrong. And it makes me feel a little bit, I can feel a little bit of a, superiority in that.
It puts you in a
Even
one-up
though,
position.
even though it's painful, I still feel, look, I'm better than you. You didn't do what I thought. And it kind of, it's a natural inclination, but it's really, really toxic.
Tell me more about why it's toxic.
Well, because what happens is I'm going to then put you in a position of one down, because I'm going to have such a high expectation, even with something that was not agreed upon verbally, right? And clearly you cannot. For example, I have couples who one of them sees the light, right? For example, they may be both of them are smokers, right? Or it could be a moralistic type thing too, where one of them says, oh, I'm not going to smoke anymore, or I'm going to start becoming vegan, or whatever it might be. And it's like, I've seen the light. Look, I'm going to be healthy now. Now you should too. But that partner did not agree upon that. And you both were smokers for many, many years, or you ate a non-vegan diet. And then all of a sudden now I have to conform to what you are now saying is the right lifestyle, but I didn't agree to this. And therefore there's this contention of, now you're wrong, I'm right, where both of you did not agree to this. And so it makes me have a moral superiority.
Oh, I'm so sorry about that. You
You
there?
freeze up.
Yeah, my internet crashed for some reason.
Okay.
Okay, so you were talking about two smokers. So you've got a
Yeah,
couple.
as two smokers, or somebody who you had maybe you both had a certain diet, and one decides they want to become vegan. Now all of a sudden there's this moral superiority of, now you have to conform, you have to stop smoking, or you have to eat vegan, or you have to start exercising like I'm exercising, or whatever it might be. Go to this church now that I'm going to this church. And now you're wrong and I'm right, and this is moral superiority. And it could be something like that, or anything like the way I clean the house. Now all of a sudden you have to conform. And so it really is a one down position I'm putting you in, because you didn't agree to this. There was not this even playing field. I'm always changing the rules.
Right. And it feels unfair. And I think it's probably hard to create a trusting, intimate, connected relationship when one partner always feels superior to the other and is putting the other partner down below them.
Yeah. And you'll hear couples that will say, one of them will be like so discouraged because they're like, I can never please you, or I'm never good enough with you. Kids feel that way. I'll never, please my parents. So I'm never good enough for them. That's a very common thing. And it's very toxic. Years and years ago, there was a therapist who shared this story about coming into the marriage experience with these expectations you're not even really aware of. He said that he was the only son, I believe, in his family, and his mother doted on him. And she was the kind that, when you're sick, let me fluff the pillows. What
Yeah.
can I do? Wipe your fevered brow. And she would bring in a whole pitcher of orange juice and set it by his bedside and pour it out for him. I mean, seriously, this was a very, loving mother. And so he was very well taken care of when he was sick. Now you can imagine what this builds up in his mind of what you do to take care of somebody when they're sick, how you act that in that role of the caretaker. Well,
Yep.
when he's newly married, what happens? Not what his mom
Not the same thing.
but see, in his mind, that's the role that you play. And so he sat there in bed and he wasn't getting out like normal. And so he thought, well, surely my wife will know I'm sick. But he didn't say anything. He just laid in bed waiting for her to come, and fluff his pillows. And so she didn't come, and she's out there doing her daily stuff. And so he thought in his mind, maybe I have to say something. And it was kind of bugging him that he'd have to say something. So he starts to moan, right? A little bit, just to let her know. Right? Yes.
Karen, I'm so sick.
And he has to bring it up a notch, because she's not coming. And the more he moans, the more he's upset with her that she can't read his mind. And so she comes in and goes, what's wrong, honey? And he's I'm sick. And he's bugged that he even has to say I'm sick, because she should just know. And so she's like, I'm so sorry. What can I do for you? And then he's extremely bugged now because he has to tell her, well, I need some orange juice.
Right. I
Shouldn't
need
you
you to
know?
fluff my pillow.
That's what you do for people who are
Get
sick.
me a cold washcloth that I can put on my forehead.
Yeah. So,
Chop,
you know,
chop.
right, right. So she goes and gets orange juice and brings back this little cup, right? Like this small cup here, and puts it right by his bed. And he looks at that like in such horror that his wife would love him this much when his mom loved him this much, right? So, he laughs about this years later because he was very selfish in that. He was trying to do mind reading. He was going to set her up to never be good enough. And we bring to the marriage relationship these expectations. Um, you shared a story, Nate, of what was something that was it your brother? You told me before that he had.
Oh yeah. The more you talk, the more I'm like, oh, there's this experience and this experience and this experience. But my brother told me the first fight that he and his wife had, it was the time they went first time they went grocery shopping together, and they needed cheese, and his wife wanted to buy like a block of cheese, and he wanted to buy pre-sliced cheese, and there was like their first fight, and
They're in the aisle of the store.
yeah, and he's like, why would you want to buy a block of cheese? It's so much more convenient to have it pre-sliced. It fits on the bread. It's the perfect thickness. It's like not inconsistent. And she's like, yeah, but the block of cheese is cheaper and you can cut off exactly how much you want and then put it away. It lasts longer. And they had their first disagreement because they had differing expectations regarding the cheese.
Yeah.
One of the examples that has been perpetual in my relationship is, like, when I was single, I never had to worry about being late to anything because I got there. All I had to worry about is me being ready when I wanted to be ready and getting there when I wanted to get there. And my wife is chronically late. We've had this conversation many times, so she won't mind me sharing. And she's part of who she is. And like, I have the expectation that we arrive at a tactful time to occasions or parties or meetings or whatever, and she's just always running 15 or 20 minutes behind regardless of how much advance notice I give her. And that's like one of the frustrations that we've had in our relationship is she doesn't like showing up early and having small talk, and I don't like showing up late and looking bad.
Yeah.
So
yeah
lots of these. So there's a question popped in that I think this is a great question. What's the line between honoring your own feelings and desires and not having expectations? Or maybe a good way to kind of phrase this is there a difference between having desires and having expectations? And if you have desires, how do you honor those without being disappointed with the expectation of having that desire met?
Yeah, and I think we all should honor our desire for, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about, a continuum, because all expectations are not equally created, right? Especially in our minds and in the mind of a partnership, we should have, and that's why we have in business contracts, right? Because we should have, it spelled out, and we should honor things that are of most value. And I hope that the viewers or people who are out there really do take to heart that pre-marriage courses, dating courses really are important to take with your significant other, because it does bring up things such as finance and discipline and, who does the laundry kind of things. Talk about those, but they do, I have to also be really careful to say, yeah, when you talk about that, when you're 19, 20, 21, even 25, and you have some kind of verbal agreement on who does the laundry, just be aware that life does change things. And even though you may say, well, this is how things are going to go when you're 25, be aware that there's a whole lifetime of different seasons you go through, and to be open and flexible and continue to have those discussions because things might change.
Yes.
So let's do talk about honoring as we go along, because that's an important question. And I would definitely say that as you're talking to somebody that you're dating or considering to cohabit or marry, that you do need to have those discussions, having those deep dive discussions about how can we honor our expectations and things that matter most. Now, how you slice the cheese is not that important, and that can be resolved, and we can look over those types of things. But the important things, such as who's going to be the disciplinarian, how can we share that role, is important to have those conversations, because that can really start to undermine one or the other who feels like they're having the burden of being the bad guy, right, all the time, of raising the kids or whatever, or initiate sex or whatever that might be. Um, in that book I referenced, The Fighting for Your Marriage, there's a really great quote. I want to read it. It says, in general, you will be disappointed or happy in life, depending on how well your perceptions of what is happening match what you expected, what you think should be happening. So disappointed or happy is, like I said before, is our outcome. How do you feel? One of the ways that I say to couples is, if you want to know if this is an unmet expectation, if you've set your partner up for expectation that, if this is one of those, this is the deal, is how do you feel? So Nate, when you have something going on with your wife or somebody that matters to you, what are some of the emotions around the expectation that was not met? What are some of those feelings?
Yeah, I've got an example of this. So we just had our first child.
Mhm.
And
Congratulations.
thank you. It's amazing. I love it. And when my wife was pregnant in that first trimester, she's not showing, but there's a baby growing in her and she's exhausted. And, there's all the hormones that are kicking into her body. And we had this agreement since the beginning of our marriage that on the days that she worked, I would make dinner. And on the days where she wasn't working, she would make dinner. So we kind of shared that responsibility. And I noticed that on the days that she wasn't working, she was becoming really lethargic. She was just like laying around and watching TV and being on her phone all day. And then dinner time would roll around. And there were like several days in a row where she was just like, I didn't do anything for dinner today. And I started to become resentful.
Uh-huh.
I started to get angry. And like you said, life throws you curveballs. And sometimes the roles and responsibilities in your relationship have to change.
Shift.
And it wasn't until we sat down and had a conversation and she's like, Nate, I've never been this tired before. I've never been this nauseous before. I need help. That it dawned on me like, oh, my wife, I forget, my wife is pregnant and she's going through something crazy, a big life shift.
Yeah.
And it's time to maybe renegotiate the responsibilities in our relationship
Very
so that
nice.
I can manage my expectations. But before that happened, I was feeling resentful. I was feeling really frustrated and angry. I was looking at my wife as an obstacle to my happiness and the joy that I was experiencing in life. I was constantly frustrated and upset. I was kind of like I was on a hairpin trigger. It was really easy to set me off.
Yeah.
But after we renegotiated and things got a lot easier.
Yeah.
So.
That's a perfect example, Nate, of how, when you're 25, you say, okay, I'll do dinner this night. But then things change. You really have to say, okay, now we have, 10 children. Things have to be a little different now, or even one child. Things have to be different sometimes.
10 children.
She made that contract when she was not, her body and her hormones and chemistry was a different scenario. So I really appreciate you bringing up the feelings, because I think if a person owns their feelings and articulates those feelings and realizes that you're, like you said, I'm using you as the obstacle to my happiness. I really need to own that, right? And I need to own that I'm feeling frustrated, disappointed, and those are my feelings. And you didn't cause that. I brought that upon myself. I think that's the first step, is to say, do I feel disappointed? Am I feeling frustrated right now? Disappointment and frustration are probably two of the most key emotions attached to expectations. So if you do feel disappointment, particularly disappointment, there's lots of other ones, anger, of course, but even for the little ones, the little orange juice, little moments in your life, or the cheese moments, right? Disappointment's always going to be there. So if you can say, I'm feeling that, then most definitely an expectation's not being met. And you need to really start thinking about, did I create that myself? Because later on, we'll talk about how to own that and how to manage that, like you did with your wife.
I love it.
Because it's definitely something that I can't force that on you and say, now you have to do that. You have to fix this to make me happy, to bring back happiness in my life. Happiness is something that I rob myself of when I put on you an expectation that was unrealistic. Do you get it?
Yeah, this conversation feels very Buddhist. I like it.
So let's see. If I have I have an author friend who named Doug Brindley, who brings up 9 areas. And I like these 9 roles. We could talk about them because it breaks it down, these 9 roles where couples have expectations, whether they have verbalized these, whether they have not, and ones that they have to re-examine over the course of a lifetime. Okay.
Great. Let's
So
talk about those.
these could be like, if you have like a couple's state of the union, inventory weekly, let's just talk about one of these, or maybe once a month, however often you want to bring it up. This is not a date night because this is more of like a state of the union, right?
Yeah.
This is one of those, managing business type things. And
we talk about that a lot. I actually just barely did a podcast this week on having a weekly marriage meeting. So this is something that everybody who's listening should be familiar with.
Yeah. And this gives you the context and maybe some of the key points to bring into that meeting. And I'd say, bring up 1, maybe 2, but this is definitely something.
All 9 is too much.
Yeah. And you don't want to overwhelm. Okay. So this is the 9 areas of role expectations of the different roles we play that I believe that we should, you should. Okay. First one is as a spouse. So if you're going to think about getting married to somebody, talk about what that role will look like. For me, how do you perceive me as a spouse? Because this is a new role I'll be playing once we're married, right? Or you. No longer are we dating. No longer are we just kind of, boyfriend, girlfriend, or whatever you want to call it. Now, what does a spouse look like to you? And so this could be something that you do before you get married, and talk about that. Another one is a kinship role. He describes as kinship, meaning I am going to be, or we are, a daughter-in-law or a son-in-law. What does that look like? I have lots of couples I talk to where, let's say, for example, the daughter, she's very enmeshed in her family, and every Sunday they go over and they have dinner, or, every week they're doing something with the family, and the husband's like, well, no, I got married to get away from
right.
And that's a little bit too much for me. And so they have to redefine this kinship role where she talks to her mom every day, and she expects him to do the same thing, like, no, that's too much family for me. What does that look like? Who sends the birthday cards to mom and dad, or mom and mother-in-law, dad-in-law? How vacations, what does that look like with kinship? The other one's a sexual. Perhaps this will be a new role for you in a sexual relationship, if that's something you are doing when you become married, or might be making or redefine that. Maybe if you're having a sexual relationship before, once you're married, now is that redefined for you? You'll need to talk about that. What does that look like? There's also the parent role. If you become parents, oftentimes if there's sexuality going on, there's going to be kids. It's funny how that happens.
Right.
One leads to the other. And so if you're going to be parents, that's a huge role. And a lot of strife and stress happens between parents who don't define expectations. And my daughter, bless her, she married somebody who her husband was very traditional in his parental role. His parents were very defined, very traditionally defined. And when they were dating, I said to my daughter, is it going to be okay with you if your husband, is not in the kitchen helping and not doing the diapers and not feeding and stuff? And it's like, I know, as a 24-year-old, that's just fine. I love him so much. You're living on love at that point. So then once their first baby comes around, she said to me,
maybe I was wrong.
My husband never changes the diaper. And she started to get frustrated with that because, of course, she saw my husband and my husband's wonderful, and he helps out with all of those domestic, things and with parenting. So you do have to realize that you may have, in your idealized world as in dating, have to redefine that when you're older. What does parenting look like? And kids change too. What does it look like to raise a baby looks different than how do you raise a 10-year-old and a 16-year-old. There's a lot of adjustments and shifts that have to happen. So these conversations need to happen a lot with the parent role. Another one's housekeeping, or just, domestic duties. How does housekeeping look like with shared household responsibilities? And that can be a big thing as well, because there could be one who really feels like they want to have more shared duties and to pitch in whenever you see. And the other one's like, no, I work 8 to 5 and that's my job. Now your job is the home and the kids. And lots of research has shown that as we have become in a more modern age, and more women who are working, that women and females are not satisfied with that traditional role as much anymore. I'm sure your wife now expects, and you are complying with, right? The idea that this is our home,
Yeah.
these are our kids, this is our dishes, this is
We still have duties that we kind of take charge over or have stewardship over, but a lot of the household duties are shared.
yeah.
A lot
And
of
you
them.
can, specialize in certain things. For example, if one really likes doing laundry or is better at it and ironing, let them do it,
Yeah.
Or if one is going out every morning, like my husband is really great at, he goes out every morning at a certain time. My job's more flexible. So he takes out garbage just because he's going out the door. So, that's just, you can kind of define that, but really it's our home, it's our kids. But decide on how housekeeping is going to look in domestic duties. The other one is an interesting, Dr. Brinley brings up the therapist role. I hadn't thought about that. Therapist role.
Yeah.
If you have an anxious concern for and about the mental and emotional health and well-being of your partner, they should come to you first, really. And then, of course, if you need to go to a doctor, therapist after that to help with those more medically or through therapy, but really on a day-to-day basis, I should touch in with my partner and say, "How was your day? Talk to me about it." And then what I do, I teach my kids or my kids and my students this: is there something very therapeutic that's been proven through science is to give your partner that 15-second or 30-second hug, right?
Yeah.
That's been proven to have that touch and to have that unity of physical alignment with them, and then just kind of wrap them up and hold them. And that's a therapeutic role. And touching and hugging is very therapeutic. Stroking them, cuddling with them, and then talking about their day and their concerns, and to see what their stress levels like, and help them to maybe feel like they have someone there that they can share their load with. That brings
this
down
this morning I just read about David Schnarch and his hugging till relaxed practice.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh, that's such a powerful activity for people to do. That prolonged hug just can psychologically, emotionally, and physically just relieve so much stress.
Yeah. You're releasing a lot of good chemicals. Oxytocin is the cuddle hug, right? Or cuddle hormone. And but also talking it out, talking through and being that person that can help you with that. Now, again, that doesn't mean that you don't go to a professional if needed, but on a day-to-day basis, you should be that. The other one's a provider. Couples should talk about who's in the provider role, earning the money, as well as also, I would say, managing the shared income. Because even if there's it's a one income family, how are you going to manage the money that comes in? And the provider role can also be something that's fluid. You can start out both being providers, and then when the kids come, one drops out, or maybe there's one to begin with and then both go later because of whatever. So be open to that and talk about that, and how managing money is a big one there. That can be a super big source of stress, right, in marriage. The other one's recreation. You'd be surprised at how couples don't examine this as well in recreation. That just means like what do you do in your free time? How do you spend it? And that should be a time of connection. When you're dating, right? A lot of times you'll be like, okay, I'll go do her thing, right? But I don't really like it. Like she likes to go to operas, or she likes whatever it is, likes to watch The Bachelor, and I'll sit there and I'll just kind of grit my teeth and get through this. But as you're married, you need to continue to do things that connect the both of you together. It doesn't mean you have to be 100% loving what each other does, but you should have enough that you can do together that you enjoy, whether that's, rock climbing, or whether it's watching The Bachelor together, or if that is, biking. What things can you do in your free time that connects you, that brings the memory making together, like you did when you were dating? You need to go back to those and continue to foster things that you love to do together. So on your date nights, if you do have weekly date nights as a couple, it shouldn't be just Netflix every week, right? You need to go back to your dating years and say, how were we creative back then? How did we connect and do some creative dating? It doesn't have to be expensive, because back then you were poor too, right?
Yeah.
So recreation is a big one, and another one is the last one. This should be the ninth one. Is the moral values, religious and moral values, because that does come up in a marriage, especially if you have kids. Like, to what extent is religiosity within the marriage going to be manifest, and how do I teach our kids those to live by certain values? That's something that does come up in, service to how do we serve our community? How do we show love for our fellow men? How do we talk about God, or what, or a deity, or whatever, a higher power? And what happens after death? Those are some things that really do come up in the lifespan, and should be discussed with, and how we teach, being honest. Because if you talk in a marriage about being honest, and yeah, we do have integrity, but then you see your partner lying to cover themselves up, even if they're little small like white lies, the kids are going to see that. Right. So you need
Right.
to talk about how you live your life with integrity. So these 9 roles are really important to examine, and we bring them without even knowing it. It's like this, like you said, it's like an invisible contract we bring in, that it's absorbed into who we are when we come to marriage. We get it from the media. We watched our parents do these roles without even knowing it. It's simply something that we absorb, and is there unconsciously, and it needs to become more conscious. So that's why talking about those 9 roles brings it to your consciousness, and we just day to day discover how closely our partner aligns with those expectations or not, and our partner's doing the same thing with us, right?
Right. I,
Um,
I I love that you brought up that we can talk about these things on a weekly basis,
mhm.
because one of the things that I'm realizing is that it's easy to have these conversations one time, and then once again have a new expectation that your partner is going to kind of always be the same after that. Oh,
Mhm.
we've established our roles. We've established how we're going to show up sexually for each other, or as parents, or religiously. But like like you said, we're constantly changing, and so having these conversations on a regular basis, it seems to me that it'll help us prevent getting blindsided by a major shift that our partner has had, that
Mhm.
there might be ashamed or scared to share with us.
Yeah. Yeah. And when they do bring that up, and we'll talk a little bit about that interview later on, but how we show up to that weekly interview, with an openness, and not condemning the person. Like you said, if they say, what, I'm feeling a shift in this, and you can't say, well, look, you're betraying me, because that's not what you agreed to ahead of time.
Right.
10 years ago you said. And so being able to be open to the fact that we are humans, and we do have change. That's part of our humanity. And there's no betrayal in this. If you decide that, like I work with, have couples that they will both be a part of, say, for example, a religious institution, and one decides to step away from that. And then you're like, yeah, but you're betraying me. That's not what who you were when I married you. We need to reframe that and say, you know what, maybe what happens is there was this quote unquote agreement, that we would go to a certain church, but that one person needs to step away for a little bit means that they're examining life in a larger context, and that me being there and being open to them and keep having that access with them will help them feel that love and support. And that's the most important thing, because again, your decisions don't determine my happiness, right?
What a
That's it.
beautiful, beautiful example. That's actually exactly the example I was thinking of, and I'm so glad that you went into a little bit more detail on that.
Yeah.
And that capstone is so perfect. Like you are in charge of your happiness.
Mhm.
Somebody else doesn't ruin your happiness through their decisions and their choices.
Yeah. Now, I don't want to undermine the fact that that is disappointing, because you wanted to share that together,
Yeah,
or whatever
great
it is.
and painful.
I
Yeah.
I also see examples of couples who say, I want to have children together. And then one steps away and says, no, no more. I don't want any more. And then you're left with, no kids at all, or maybe just one. And that's super disappointing for the person who you had agreed on having 5 kids to begin with, right? So managing those is a big deal. And I know that is hard. But having access to that person, having them feel open and vulnerable with you, is like you said, the number one thing. And then managing expectations can go more smoothly. One of
Awesome.
the things that I hear that you need to think about in your mind is to know, if I have an expectation Number one, of course, is the emotion. But the second of all, if I know I have an expectation, is the words that come out of my mouth. If I say things like, you should have, or you should be, or you're supposed to, or why didn't you, or you need to, any of those, you shoulds, you're supposed to, why didn't you, all are trigger words. That means I'm imposing an expectation on you,
Mm.
and that is unfair. Even if it's something that maybe that you had assumed ahead of time or you talked about, I'm then setting you up for failure because you're not good enough for me. So watch those words. Those are trigger words, because what you expect is normal is not always going to be normal for your spouse. Okay. Now, there's something that Doug Brindley talks about that's just super awesome to also kind of quantify this. It's kind of cool, where he talks about role expectations, role performances, and role discrepancy. So let's just talk about, again, and it's kind of a way to frame it in your mind. An expectation is what you think is normal, right? A normal behavior to my spouse, from my spouse. A role performance is what they actually do. And then the role discrepancy is what is the difference between those two.
Yeah, the gap.
Yeah. So for example, let me give you a little minor thing. And that is my dad growing up, he was a mechanical engineer. He had a PhD, right? He was really, really smart. He could build anything without even a blueprint. And he basically fixed everything that we ever had growing up. He built our garage. And so I never knew what a handyman was when I was growing up, right? Never. We never called a plumber, electrician. He did everything. Now, imagine what that sets up in my mind for my dear husband, right? Who's an accountant. He's good with numbers, right? That's
He
his
has
thing.
soft hands. He doesn't have callous hands.
Not the hammer. And so can you imagine in my mind, if I had, like, for example, coming from my background, my role expectation would be like an 8 or a 10 on what someone should do to fix a leaky faucet or whatever, right? Or hang a door. And the real performance is what he actually does. Well, look, what if my number for him in my head is like an 8 or a 10 of handymanning, right? And he does a 3 or a 4. Then what's the difference? We're looking at a 5. That's pretty significant with a discrepancy. With such a great big number, I need to be aware that I've set him up for a 5 of me being disappointed. One other example of my husband is that I grew up with a dog, and I love animals. I love pets. And we've had pets over the years, but we found out that he kept getting a sinus infection and he was allergic.
Oh.
And so it was so devastating because to me, having a pet is a 10. And then for my husband, the person who's allergic, it's a 0, right? He cannot do it. And so I have a 10 of disappointment, right? And so that's the discrepancy. And I have to manage that and say, yeah, but was I fair? Was that reasonable? And we'll talk about, what that means for a couple. But I have to know that I'm going to have a 10 and a degree of 10
right.
out of 10 of pain and disappointment and frustration.
Or you just need to invest in a turtle.
Right. See, those seep in, and I need to be realistic with what I was asking, because that's a big frustration, right?
That's great real world examples. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So in that couples interview, or did you call it inventory every week? Talk about those 9 roles, and when they creep up, you can address them. Okay. So those 9 roles are really good, but again, just manage 1 or 2. Now, the idea here is when you come to the state of this union, or inventory, this is not to have your laundry list, my list of complaints.
Right.
Here, I want to talk about the parent role, because you're not doing your part, right? I'm doing the homework all the time, and you got to help them with the science fair project, right? This is not here to me to come and bag on you, right? Okay. So the idea here with the inventory is to say, honey, how easy am I to approach in this area? What are my blind spots? How can I assist you? How can I help, to lessen your load in this area? It's all about me. So that's important with these inventories, is that you say, let me open up my vulnerability and you help me. And then my reaction to them, well, if I go defensive, what are you talking about? I do too. I help with homework all the time. Then how often do you think they're going to come to me and express. No,
Yeah.
not at all.
Not
So
a
I'm shutting the
happen.
door on that intimacy, right? And so make sure that as you have discussed these 9 roles and have these inventories, that it's all about how I can open up and look at you and say thank you so much. Now in my head could be thinking, I don't know what in the heck you're talking about. That's not. But I quiet that voice down and I say thank you. And you know what? After a while, it could, after the interview, after you think about it, the next week or two, you could be like, they kind of are right, but because we're so defensive and we're always one up ourselves and saying, no, I do better than I really do. We always over report what we do, how often we load the dishes. Oh, I do it all the time, right?
Yeah.
We always over report. And so maybe as you open yourself up and then thank them for that feedback, and then they do the same, then that is the key to progress of having that unity in all those areas. Do what, and the spouse roles. Do we work as a team? Am I loved? Am I appreciated by my spouse? This is an ongoing conversation, the spouse role. And the kinship role. How much time should we spend with the in-laws? Does your family like and appreciate me? What can I do more to help with your family? And how can we negotiate the in-laws? And then sexual role, frequency of sex, who initiates it? What are some things that I can help out with that? That's a vulnerable conversation to have. In the parental role, do you spend enough time with the kids, both of you, or is it one that's has the majority of the time with the kids? How do we share that role a little bit better? Equaling our approach to disciplining the kids with the United Front. That's a big one as well. The housekeeping role. How can we share the chores more fairly? How can I help you to feel more supported around the house? Or am I feeling more exploited by you?
Right.
The therapist role, we can have discussions in our inventory, such as, do I listen well to you?
Do you
Do
feel
I,
like you can talk to me?
can you talk to me, without judgment? When I have a meltdown, do you rush to judge or dismiss it? Oh, you're always emotional, or just suck it up, or whatever. Or do you sit with me when I'm having a real hard time? Are things kept confidential?
Mm.
Um, or do you go and talk to your mom about me all the time? I don't
Yeah.
like that, right? And in the provider role, again, are we saving responsibly? Are we spending responsibly? Who's earning the money that we feel that we're both contributing to the family? In the recreation role, again, are you using your free time that you both feel like you're having times of connection, times of, like when we were dating, we have fun together, and you don't begrudge that time. And then the moral and religious values, are you fulfilled in your religious needs? How I can support you better? Good role models for our kids that way.
I love that.
So yeah, those are the 9 areas. And
Is this framework from the Fighting from Your Marriage book?
the
Or is
9
this from
roles are from the author, Dr. Brinley. And I really do appreciate the way he broke it down like that. And
is it in a book of his?
um,
Or is
I
it just one of his frameworks?
believe so. I believe it is. I can look that up for
That's
you.
okay. I'll check. I'll look
Yeah.
for it.
And one thing that we can also bring up, and that is the 80-20 principle, Nate, and that is that, whoever you marry, it does not matter. Whoever you marry, you're going to like 80% of them. They're going to be awesome, right? And those are things
Right.
that matter. Those are things that I married you for. Those are things that mattered. And then 20%, I would had blinders on when we were dating, or I just dismissed those things. But as we share a life together, they're a lot more obvious, the 20% that I don't like so much. But
Uh-huh.
those were not the deal breakers for me. And so I don't want to inflate or conflate those things and now make the 20% the big deals, right? I need
Right.
to, when expectations means that, those were not big deals for me when we were dating. And those are not things that are deal breakers for me now. So I'm going to focus on what I love about you most. And if I'm always being frustrated about the little things, and those become then 80% of what I hate about you, right?
Mm.
And so focusing on the 80% makes you more approachable, makes me more vulnerable with you, and it makes life worth staying together for, because it's 80% that we chose each other for. I chose you because that 80%. There's a really great, let me read this quote by Rabbi Harold Kushner. He's a really great theologian, and he's of course Jewish. He says the illusion of perfection in the partner will not last. And that is why the essence of marital love is not romance, but forgiveness. Of those 20% of things that don't really matter, right?
Yeah.
Forgiveness as the truest form of love means accepting without bitterness the flaws and imperfections of our partner and praying that our partner accepts our flaws as
Oh,
well. Ugh. Mature marital love sees faults clearly and forgives them, understanding that there are no perfect people and that an imperfect spouse is all that an imperfect person like us can aspire to. Let me read that again. I love
yeah,
that.
yeah. That's so powerful.
Understanding that there are no perfect people and that an imperfect spouse is all that an imperfect person like us can aspire to. Or that's all I can get in this life because
Yeah.
I'm imperfect too. If we cannot love imperfect people, if we cannot forgive them of their exasperating faults, we will condemn ourselves to a life of loneliness because imperfect people are the only kind we will ever find.
This is such a mind shift from the perspective that I think we're all naturally inclined to take, which is I need to fix my partner. Like you show up, these are the reasons you're making my life miserable. But when you show up saying like, I accept the 20% of the things that you do that drive me nuts, and I'm going to focus on the 20% of things that I do that drive you nuts and see how I can make myself better, how I can make myself more forgiving, more patient, more understanding, more compassionate. And as I do that, I see you more positively, and those 20% of things that drive me nuts become less bothersome.
Mm.
And you also show up with a renewed desire to work on those 20% of things that drive me nuts because you see me working on mine. And it's so much more. It's counterintuitive, but it's so much more effective, a more effective way to find like real meaning and happiness and joy in your relationship.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I love
Yeah,
that.
absolutely right. And so I really do believe that if I show grace and forgiveness on the little things that could be irritating and I could blow them up, if I show and say, you know what, it doesn't matter, never mind, then I'm giving myself permission to focus on the 80% and put my time and energy into that I love. And then my partner will see that. And then if they're a person with conscience and a conscience and a person with, humility as well, then they're going to do the same, afford me the same.
Beautiful.
Now we talked about the continuum. I do need to bring that up. And the person who asked the question, I do need to honor the fact that there are some things that I call the absolutes. And the absolutes and are in my 20 are in my 80%, right? So when I'm dating someone or in marriage, I expect, or in a business partnership, I expect, the person will be trustworthy.
Mhm.
I can trust you. You're not gonna, do anything that's gonna be um, dishonest with me. Infidelity, especially with marriage, right?
Yeah.
And so those are types of things that we do need to examine and make sure that we are on a 10, right? That is something that's a 10. And there's other things that, kindness, things like that I do expect. Now, there's other things such as, birthdays and how we celebrate birthdays and, the degree of how much you're going to help around the house or whatever. Those are things that on the continuum can go up and down, especially during, right after having a baby. Maybe your wife's going to do less and you're going to do more or whatever. But and also the provider role can shift. Sometimes someone might lose a job and then I have to step up and do more and then they do less and whatever. But those are things that I can negotiate that I shouldn't be so rigid in. That's like, you disappointed me. No, those are things that can move up and down on the continuum. Maybe you have a spouse where it was important for him to be home and he had a job for the first 10 years of your life where he was home more often. But then he gets laid off and then he has a job where he has to travel
Mm.
and he's not home a lot. Okay. Am I going to be frustrated, disappointed, and then, bringing that down on him and saying, look, you're not doing what you're supposed to do that we agreed on? No, I'm going to support him and saying, you know what, that is something that can shift on the continuum. That you're not home as often matters to me because you're providing, and the
Mm.
provider role is way more important for me.
I,
So be with
I've seen things like that happen, and it's devastating. Like
your.
it's really interesting to see how people deal with that shift in
Mhm,
their relationship. I did a seminar a couple of years ago, and there's a woman and her husband who stayed afterwards, and she was so angry at her husband because when they got married, he said, "I'll be the provider, and you will always be the stay-at-home parent." And then he went on and started his own business, and a deal went south, and the company was really struggling, and they started to struggle financially. And she was so angry that like they had to move away from the place that they were living, and they were in a position where she was on the verge of having to go back to work, and she was just so resentful towards her husband about how he's not keeping his promise that he made her on day one.
Yeah.
And it was just really interesting to see how they were navigating that as a couple, and they weren't examining their expectations, and they
Yeah.
weren't taking responsibility for their own happiness.
Yeah, they weren't. And that's the important thing that you bring up, and is that what were the key things that they still were honoring? It's integrity, trust, kindness. Those things didn't vary. Now, who brings in the money? That should be something that on the continuing can be
Right.
negotiable depending
Yep.
on lifespan, right?
Yep.
So don't be so rigid in those things that aren't really the deal breakers, right?
Right. Wonderfully said.
So practice charity, realize sometimes that differences are strengths, and respect your partner's core beliefs. And also learn that some areas can not be resolved and let them go, and focus on the 80% that I love you and the 20% I can overlook. In the fighting for your marriage, I want to end with this. I think that in the chapter, which I love so much in that book, they had 4 steps to managing unrealistic expectations. So, for example, let me go back to the idea of me wanting a dog
Yeah.
and my husband can't, right? So, the first one in the book, it talks about to manage your expectations so that you own it, right? And I really want to make sure that I show up, not putting you in a position that you're always going to fail me, right? So, the first one is to be aware of what you expect. A lot of it, like I said, is unconscious. We get it from our, family of origin. We get it from the media. We get it from whatever, right? Am I aware of what I expect? Do you understand what you are asking your partner to do? Can you actually verbalize it? The orange juice example, he was not even doing step number 1, right? He was thinking, a lot of mind, we talk about mind reading in marriage or, relationships. This is the number 1 thing. Were you aware and did you verbalize it? If
Right.
you can't answer that, then no, you're the one at fault. Okay. And own that. I didn't verbalize that. And I wasn't even conscious that I was expecting that of you.
Yeah. It
Okay.
reminds me of a Terry Real quote. He says, "You're not allowed to be upset about not getting something you never asked for."
Exactly. So this is the first litmus test. And if you can't pass this one, then it's on you. All right. Then
Love it.
stop being disappointed in your partner. This was you. Second one is, are you clear about what you expected? Are the expectations defined and agreed upon by both partners? Or are you just superimposing and judgment of what you should or should not be doing, right? So we talk about, for example, the raising kids or disciplining kids, or doing the homemaking. You're going to help out with the house. Well, you can say that, but be clear. Well, you were supposed to do the laundry. What does the laundry mean? Be
Right.
clear about what you expect, and also be clear that things can shift over the lifespan. The third one is be reasonable with what you expect. For example, having the dog, I really was aware of it. I was clear about it. But am I reasonable? No, I'm not anymore. Because once we found out that he can't have that or he gets sick, then I'm not reasonable, right? Are you expecting more than your spouse is able to do? Are you giving allowances for changing circumstances and
Yeah.
other conflicts in life? If I'm not being reasonable, and this is their third one, I think, is the one that trips up couples the most. Because yeah, they were aware of it, they verbalized it, but I'm not reasonable with you. I'm not being reasonable. And I know it's hard, but for example, like, if they change their diet, if they have a different exercise, and or talk about going to church thing, or even with having the number of kids, am I being reasonable with them then? Or is this something that I really need to step back and say, I was expecting more than they're able to give?
Yeah.
And if I can do that, if I can give them that allowance, then that's not to say that later on down the road, they may change again and come back to my position. But that's the problem. If you push them in the corner, then that makes them even more rigid in their
More
position,
resisting.
but resistant. But if I'm reasonable and say, I give you grace, I give you space to be who you are, then you know what? If I have that loving kindness towards my partner, then more often than we can meet somewhere, right? That's a lot more close, more compromising, or a lot more appeasing to both of us. The last one is just
This strikes me as the step that, if you're not careful with it, it could turn you into a nag or a petulant child or a micromanager of your partner and their time and how they spend their energy. So I love this idea of like, are my expectations unreasonable? Like we had a conversation with a woman the other day. She's like, I just want my husband to take out the trash. And I'm like, right. Do you want him to take out the trash when you want to take out the trash, or do you want him to take out the trash on his timetable? And she's like, oh, that's a good question. And she said they had company coming over, and she decided to change her approach. And she said, hey, the Johnsons are coming over at 5 o'clock. Could you please just make sure the trash is taken out before they arrive?
Mhm.
And she said the next couple hours drove her nuts because like 3 o'clock went by and 4 o'clock went by. And normally she'd be like, honey, take out the trash, take out the trash. And then she'd end up doing it herself. And at like 4:55, he ran downstairs, grabbed the trash and took it outside. And she's like, he did it, but he did it on his timetable. And it's just interesting how sometimes we want things done, but we want them done our way.
Yeah.
And that can be an unreasonable expectation as well.
Yeah, and even the trash thing, even if she wants to, because that's what her dad does, that's what men do, is that really reasonable? I mean, women can take out trash.
Yeah.
And I this is a silly example, but let me just give you this. I talk to my students about this. The one thing that, is the example that everyone gives is the toilet seat. Women are so, they nag because their husband don't put the toilet seat down. And I say to them, is that reasonable? Guess what? Your husband uses the toilet 50% of the time. Why is he nagging you to say, why don't you leave the toilet seat up for me?
Right.
It's just a total paradigm shift of saying, you know what? He should be saying, leave the toilet seat up for me. 50%.
I like you.
This toilet is mine too. 50% of the time, I want the toilet seat up. So it's not reasonable to say, you have to put it down for me every time. I'm just saying, that's just a little silly example of, is it reasonable, right?
I'm applauding you.
I'm like, why don't I leave the toilet seat up for, be nice to her husband, leave it up for him.
Yep.
Anyway, the last one is I know, be motivated. This is a great one. Be motivated to meet the other's expectations, even when they're not the same as yours, within reasonable limits. My husband had the right to expect to be healthy. Right? Was I respecting that he wants to stay well and a dog was not helping him stay well? So I need to be motivated to say, husband, dog, I guess the dog goes, right? And so I have to say, when that was hard for me, I have to be motivated to say, he matters to me. He's my whole world. And as much as I love pets, pets go. I'm motivated enough to say pets go. So are you both willing to give and take and improve as human beings in this marriage? And then in those, in that partnership inventory, you can talk about, having your partner hold up a mirror to show you how you can improve in that area. So those are some things that are the 4 steps to managing expectations if they're unrealistic.
And those come from that book, Fighting for Your Marriage, right?
Yeah. The book is just fabulous, and I really highly recommend it. And it's this one right here. I'll show it to you. It's my orange Bible by Markman, Stanley, and Blueberg.
I love it.
Okay. Yeah. So there you go. That's just a really great conversation on expectations, because they really do. They are the undercurrent of all intimate relationships.
I feel like calling this a really great conversation about expectations is an understatement. That was, you far surpassed my expectations. And I can tell already, like, we had a couple of people watching this live in a Facebook group, and they like, I'll just show you right now, they're just like, whoa, this is amazing. This is so great. So like, I know that this is going to go out on the podcast as well. Tons of people will really appreciate your insights and probably want to dig into these resources that you shared. I appreciate you providing so much clarity around a topic that, like I said at the beginning, we say, oh, unmet expectations are the source of unhappiness in marriage, or you need to get rid of your expectations if you want to be happy. But you breaking this down into such simple frameworks that allow couples to move forward and have conversations about their expectations and create more clarity and create more concrete agreements and have ongoing negotiations about this stuff. Like, that is going to be life-changing for people. I know that there's going to be a lot of people who listen to this who are going to feel really inspired. And I really appreciate you sharing your time and expertise and wisdom with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nate.
Is there anywhere that you would like people to go if they wanted to learn more about you and your work, or if they wanted to learn more about some of the stuff that you talked about today?
I do have a website. It's mostly on parenting. It's called a spoonfulofparenting.com.
Great.
And I've written 2 books on parenting. I apologize, it's not about marriage, but marriage and parenting go hand in hand.
It's one of those 9 roles.
One of the books is called Keep It Real and Grab a Plunger, 25 Tips for Surviving Parenthood. I know, the publisher came up with the title, not me. Keep it real Keep It Real and Grab a Plunger, 25 Tips for Surviving Parenthood. And the other one is called Parenting with Spiritual Power.
Awesome. Well, I will make sure to link to those in the description. So if people want to go check out your books or your website, that they have easy access to it. And once again, thank you so much for sharing your time.
Thanks, Nate. Have a great day.
I will.